Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Mulan from 1998. Mulan, which was actually Disney's 36th produced animated feature, came at a time when the Disney Renaissance was sort of on a downturn. I actually don't consider anything after Pocahontas to be part of the Disney Renaissance, but I know people get loose about that sort of thing, so if you consider this part of it, fine, don't complain to me in the comments. But Pocahontas was a pretty big failure, especially culturally. Hunchback of Notre Dame and Hercules, despite how much we love them now and how you feel about them, and this isn't a review of those movies, culturally did not really take. And Mulan was kind of a definite return to form in terms of at least Western perception, mostly because this is a little more straightforward than at least the two previous films next to this had been, as well as being sort of more simpler and more direct plot-wise than we had seen in other films as well. Also, I think this film, I don't know if this film is better than those, I don't really want to say that, but I remember at the time, people were much more excited by this. It didn't, ignite the way the previous Disney Renaissance films did, which really, just took over culturally, those first four in there. With Mulan, it just felt like people wanted a good, sturdy Disney film. Now, I think people were a little too harsh on this, particularly most of the perception at the time was that Eddie Murphy was involved in this and how crazy it was that he was a voice in an animated movie. But that was more the perception that Eddie Murphy was trying to do his sort of Robin Williams role in a Disney film. But it's almost like if you actually, watch the movie, he's not a big enough of a part of it, to be honest with you, as much as Robin Williams was in Aladdin. Mulan definitely has more of a classical, straightforward kind of Disney style. The difference between this and Hercules, for example, or Hunchback, or even Tarzan that would come after it, there were so many different versions of those stories in terms of the cinematic landscape, particularly, in the Western perception of film. But seriously, there really were lots of versions of various pretty notable versions of Hunchback of Notre Dame. There's a lot of Hercules movies. There's a ton of Tarzan movies as well, going back to both Hercules and Tarzan, going back to the beginning of film. So when you look at all three of those are kind of obviously Disney's spin on tales that you've definitely heard or read or seen several times of those origin stories before. Hell, Greystoke was in the 1980s. I'm sure there was a Hercules in the 80s I'm forgetting about. I don't remember the Hunchback thing, but Mulan, for most Western audiences, was sort of a new story, and I think that sort of works in what Disney usually does, and going all the way back to Dumbo, actually, if we really want to get into it, after having kind of the financial failure that was Pinocchio, although kind of Disney film really bombed because they find a way to re-release it and make money off of it forever. But in terms of box office, at least, in terms of box office, Pinocchio was very expensive flop, so they made a more straightforward, cheaper animated film, and that was Dumbo. Mulan wasn't actually cheaper. It's almost the same budget-wise, 10 to 20 million difference between all these other movies. But it definitely feels that way. It feels more straight ahead, much like, how Cinderella, which feels a little more straightforward, although excellently crafted, story-wise. Dumbo, same way. Lilo and Stitch a little bit later. And Mulan is that way as well. It doesn't feel as bombastic as we'd see from the other Disney Renaissance films, or the John Musker, Ron Clements stuff, even with Hercules, for example, which feels very bombastic, and there's songs and gospel music and stuff. And this doesn't really have that. It's very it's a total different vibe. And I think that was more of a vibe that they were doing in the late 90s, as well as I think the zeitgeist of, the Lilith Fair just happened. You're having Xena Warrior Princess, Buffy the Vampire Slayer was just coming into popularity as a TV show. We were getting more of that, kind of girl power sort of thing. So Mulan was almost the perfect time to release a movie like this. But that's certainly one of the things I really like about this film is you always get you're following this character Mulan, you're kind of being told this story by the Disney Corporation, which you'd never heard before. Now, it did feel like a new story. I never heard this story before the Disney film. And I know this film came out in China. It took a while to come out because China was sort of mad at Disney because of the Kundun thing, which was a film directed by Martin Scorsese, biography of the Dalai Lama, which they weren't happy with them, but they eventually released it. They actually released it away from a major holiday, right after, so it wouldn't do well as compared to films that are actually made in China. So an extra fuck you. And Chinese audiences did not like it because it was too Western influenced. Although I was kind of wondering, because when we look at Hercules and all these other films, although that might be how you first heard of Hercules or Tarzan, those directors obviously knew other versions, and they're kind of playing off of the fact that this story has been told so many times. And these directors clearly were not. Now, the biggest film version that I could find that was not, there's certain versions, opera, that's based on the poem that Mulan comes from, and the legend of Mulan, but the one that's more kind of straightforward, not straightforward, but more of a drama, sort of closer to this one, would be Mulan Joins the Army, which is actually sort of a big hit to kind of like, as the Japanese occupation of China was going on, it was kind of made people feel proud and more patriotic about China at a time, right as World War II was happening, made a major movie star out of the woman who played Mulan. It was like a big cultural moment. So if you're wondering, I haven't seen that film. I'd actually kind of be curious to see that in juxtaposition to this, especially with the live action one coming out soon, since that seems to be kind of a big moment in Chinese cinema. If you're someone who's more familiar with that film or any other versions of Mulan, I know there's television versions, I know there's an opera, I know there's a silent film version. There are a lot of versions. I don't think it has as many as like Hercules or Tarzan. I haven't seen them, so they might be better than all those versions of them, because a lot of those are crappy. I am curious to see Mulan Joins the Army. The 1939 one seems to be, it did spark kind of a popularity in the legend of Mulan and the literature of Mulan and everything like that, so which probably inadvertently sort of, I guess, led to this. I don't know necessarily, but I could not find really any tie from that film to this film. But it is sort of interesting to think about how all of those films, Tarzan, Hercules, Hunchback of Notre Dame, that are around this movie are under our perception of these stories as a Western movie-going audience. And Mulan's success is kind of almost in a juxtaposition to those, because there isn't a version of that we've seen, unless those films came out in America, but I could find very little information. I don't think 1940s American audiences were super into seeing a film starring Asian leads right in World War II, but hey, I don't know, maybe they released it later, but most likely I don't think they did. As a movie with this film, what I really like about it is Mulan is such a strong character, but what I really like about her is that this film almost sort of kind of does all the Disney tropes, but at the same time sort of rejects them. You have Mulan, who, although she could fall in love with the captain who's training her, you know, you sort of get hints of that, but you don't really get that, although he doesn't think she's a girl, and this is a very binary film, but you don't really get those sort of things in it. It doesn't acknowledge them. It's more about her becoming kind of like this warrior and doing her father proud and protecting her family, which I think is very different from a lot of the Disney princess stuff, because there's always a love element involved with that as well. And Mulan, there isn't. You know, that's just like sort of not there. You kind of get hints at it, but for the most part, what you get is her becoming like this warrior and showing like how smart and how good of a warrior she can be and how she can save everyone from the Huns who are going to invade China. I'm not really going to talk about the plot because I feel like most of you sort of know it. I do think the threat of this army and Shen Yu is so terrifying in a lot of the whole idea of the doll. He holds this doll, and it's a really simple silent film kind of imagery in that, and he's holding it. He's let's return the doll, and then you see in the rubble, you see the doll, and like, I mean, that doesn't mean shit to Mulan. She doesn't know. I mean, other than it's a kid and that's sad, but you know the significance of that doll, how he's so evil. He found the idea that there were children down there and that he could destroy them and he could kill them, and his vengeance is that strong. Although we don't get, you know, what that whole conflict's about. He's just sort of like an evil person, and I have read other reviews saying he's one-dimensional. I don't necessarily agree with that. Well, okay, I guess he is, but I look at more of his function in the story, because I don't think we would really need a villain like Jafar, or need one of the more cooler villains like what James Woods plays Hades and all these things. Like, those are fun, you know, you have a cool character actor or a good actor playing that villain. This, although Miguel Ferrer, I think, is a good actor, not Asian at all, by the way, which goes into how Western this film is, unless I'm misunderstanding something about him. But it very much plays under the whole thing of like how evil this story and kind of simpler this story is. And I think it lets us kind of build more with Mulan and the army and Mushu and build with those characters rather than spend a lot of time with the villain. Now that might be a lesser point, because maybe it just doesn't really want to get into it. They're sort of just like the bad guys or whatever. They're not, you know, more multifaceted. We don't really totally understand why they're doing this. In terms of how the story is told, I don't necessarily think we needed that, and I'm sure that would have made it far more complicated. I think this one works more in the simplicity of, there is this evil army bad, Mulan needs to be on the good army that's good, and she needs to show her worth against this like ultimate evil, and it definitely plays within that kind of icon. I mean, when you see that rebel, you get like, oh my god, these guys are like really evil. Like they just like, there's no survivors. They destroyed the army. They killed this guy's dad. Like this is incredibly tragic. There are huge stakes involved, and it plays off of those stakes, because it's one thing to have like a jokey villain, and it's another thing to have a villain that will like destroy you. This film plays more as kind of a good, kind of war picture with Disney elements. There are like a lot of comic relief actually, but it doesn't play as overdoing it, which we would definitely get into that with certain things from even like, somewhat with Hunchback and, with the DreamWorks era, which was about to be upon us after this. But with Eddie Murphy and, you have the people like the character Harvey Fierstein voices and things like that, and even June Foray being a comedic element. But it's interesting that the leads are so straightforward, between Mulan and her father and things like that. They're almost kind of like, sort of like rejecting this more dramatic thing in a little way, or punching it up so it's a little more digestible for the kids. But what's funny is I do think people like those characters, but I think what's more memorable is the drama elements and not the comedy elements, which usually they were in this era, but I think because the dramatic elements played so true, there's something about watching someone learn and become great at something, which is always an incredible great story to watch as an audience member. Think of something like, and not because of its Asian influences, but a film that I think is good for kids to watch actually is Karate Kid, because the original Karate Kid, because when you're watching that film, you're like, why is he even doing this? What's this wax on, wax off crap? Like, what's going on? He's just wasting his time with this old guy. And then in the end, you're like, oh my god, he is the best around, and it's like triumphant. And I think Mulan plays in that way, where you're not sure if she's ever going to do it. This is an incredibly stupid idea on her end. She has like no combat training. She's with this group of army that is a complete group of misfits. She is a dragon who probably shouldn't be there. All these things. And it doesn't play off of like, haha, it's a goofy thing. Like they really play up like they are very ill prepared to deal with a thing that is one of the ultimate evils that this giant country has ever dealt with. They had to build a giant wall, and that didn't actually work. Like, she does it, and she did it because she's a smart person. She's very smart. She did, an avalanche. She figured out how to defeat him. She did that with her intelligence, with her smarts, but also because has such a strong will to her. She's not going to give up. She's not going to let her father go to war, and she's not going to just like let this not work. This has to work, and she's not going to fail at doing this. And that's an awesome thing to watch as an audience member. You have so much faith in this character because you've kind of gone on that arc with them, and I think that's why people have such passion behind Mulan. This film did do a little better. It kind of helped the perception in the late 90s between Mulan and Tarzan that Disney kind of critically and culturally sort of came back a little bit. It didn't really work out for too long, but Mulan kind of started the upward trend, and Mulan kind of like helped things come back, was better received. People quite liked it. I do think people, if you read criticism at the time, they're overly harsh on it, particularly like the Eddie Murphy thing seemed to really bug people at the time. And now I watch it and sort of forget about it and go like, but Donkey was okay? Okay, guys. I actually think Eddie Murphy's pretty good in this. The music sometimes feels very 80s, even though it's 1998. Like, I like the Reflection song. I remember we sang it in a high school choir I was in, and people loved that. That's really the first time you heard Christina Aguilera. Genie in a Bottle would come out like the next summer, so it really was like the beginning of her, because that song was like every girl who sang in high school at the time sang Reflection, which is a great song. There's a lot of very like gendered songs in this, like I'll Make a Man Out of You with the Donny Osmond song. I love that no one knew that was Donny Osmond, which if you read press at the time, it was pretty much Donny Osmond's in this Disney movie and there's a bunch of Asian people or something. I don't know. Now everyone forgot that, which probably a better part in history if we're being honest there. I feel like BD Wong could probably sing. He looks like he has that presence, like you think he could sing, but because he was the speaking voice, but for some reason they went with Donny Osmond. He was actually a little more popular in the late 90s. I like the voice cast. I like Ming-Na Wen as Mulan. I sort of like Miguel Ferreira in it, even though it's sort of inappropriate. It is very Western, and I think they try their best, especially in the late 90s, which wasn't great, but I think for the most part it's on the better end. They do try to, the backgrounds are watercolored and trying to be like actual Chinese art and things like that. But it seems like, Chinese audiences did not like this. They felt it was too Western, especially reading the bigger film version of Mulan meant so much to patriotism at the time. To have another country do one, I think probably wouldn't go over too well. I've always kind of liked this film. I kind of didn't see it actually when it came out because I was like too cool for school teen, and then when I did see it, I actually quite like it. I think it is probably one of the better told ones of the late 90s Disney Renaissance. I don't know if any of them hold up to the Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, Lion King for me personally, but after those, I might put this one first, although I do quite like Hercules. It's my daughter, after watching Mulan, we've been watching a lot of Hercules, so cool. Also, Chris Sanders and Dean DeBlas, who would then make Lilo and Stitch. Also, this was made at the Florida studio, not where all the other films were made in California, and they would also, that studio would make Lilo and Stitch, but Chris Sanders and Dean DeBlas would do Lilo and Stitch and then the first How to Train Your Dragon. Chris Sanders actually stopped them from making this and do a Tootsie type kind of slapsticky kind of film, so thank God. Those two, you kind of get hints at like what they could achieve because Dean DeBlas was doing storyboards on this, and you can tell how good he is at making action sequences, which we would later see in the How to Train Your Dragon movies. But ever since I've seen this film, I've liked it, but I like how straightforward it is, and I think that's probably one of its pluses, much like Dumbo and Cinderella before it, kind of showing when Disney needs to pare things down. They can actually do pretty spectacular things. What might feel like sort of a simpler kind of studio film kind of highlights like when the studio is like working to its advantage, it can really do some magnificent things. And sure, the story of Mulan wasn't as well known at the time for American audiences, but this presented it in such a way that it helped like inspire to multiple audiences. And I get why Chinese audiences don't like this movie and don't agree with it, but I also get like what was so cool with it at the time and why it's held up so well, because it's able to be fun, it's able to be straightforward with it. And although these two directors wouldn't do a lot, Barry Cook and Tony Bancroft, who would recently do Animal Crackers, actually, I get why Disney doesn't make too many of these because they're not sort of like flashy enough. But it's kind of like, it's interesting because as many times you hear about all those other films, it's like the effects with Tarzan or the style or something, and I agree the style's a little flatter and it's not as like eye-catching in a lot of ways, but I think what grabs you with Mulan in this one is the story. You walk away with the story of Mulan and you're inspired by it and you're enthralled by it, and I think that's a really great thing to show as Disney as a studio, because regardless of its faults and its evilness and taking over the world and things, Disney can at some points be very good at story, and I think Mulan showcases that very well. And at a time when people were sick of the studio, or also just 3 years before, got upset about how its representation of Native Americans could sort of turn that around and do a good story from another culture that they probably shouldn't have messed with but did anyway, and actually presented like a well-made film with a tight story and an awesome screenplay. And I think this shows probably strip away all the fantastical things, all the operatic bombastic things from Hunchback or Hercules or something like that, and just give us a straight ahead story. And when you think about a Disney moment and all those things, what we're really thinking about is a good story that you can tell your kids and that they will remember. And I think ultimately that's what works so well about Mulan, because they stripped it all down and sort of gave you that, and still, had fun and had a sidekick and, comedic elements and things. It brought you like this legendary story and presented it to, kind of more worldwide audiences than probably really knew it before. Not that that makes it okay or anything. And I think Disney was able to do so much with that kind of a thing because they were able to showcase what they're most known for, is just being, kind of the storytellers of sort of folklore. That's something that Chinese audiences were okay with. And despite that, and probably a lot of cringy elements that I probably forgot to talk about, I still think they're able to hold up and be the solid storytellers of folklore, even if they're exploiting it for their own financial means or whatever, that they've always meant to be. So if you've seen Mulan and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.